Good afternoon from Geneva. A warm welcome to the Trade Dialogue webinar. In this webinar, we will have an in-depth look at the World Trade Report 2020. This report looks at the role of government policies to promote innovation in an increasingly digitized world. It cannot be more timely, as the COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated the adoption of digital technologies, underlying the role of governments in directing resources and serving social objectives. It has also called for more innovative solutions to tackle the pandemic. My colleagues will give a detailed presentation to the report in a few moments. Before they do so, I would like to acknowledge that this report has been the intellectual fruit of many colleagues across the WTO Secretariat. The report was developed under the general responsibility of Deputy Director General Xiao Zhunyi and Robert Koopman, Director of the Economic Research and Statistics Division. The authors of the report are Marco Buon, Mark Bacchetta, Cosimo Bevarelli, Eddie Beckers, Kian Kasegari Bosada, Emmanuel Gan, John Hancock, Catherine Linguist, Gabriel Marceau, Jose Montero, Roberta Piermartini, Stella Rubinova, Victor Stosenberg, Qing Ye, and myself. We're also indebted to colleagues from many divisions of the WTO Secretariat who provided invaluable contributions to this report. They're duly acknowledged in this report. This report is composed of 4 parts. Section A gives an introduction. Section B looks at the trends in government policy and explains how today's new industrial and innovation policies are truly new. Section C then analyzes the economic rationales of the innovation policy and why a shift towards a knowledge-based economy may justify a larger and smarter role of the government. It also examines how effective certain policy tools are. And Section D examines how and where innovation strategies interact with global trade rules and proposes aspects where international cooperation is needed. My colleagues Marco Buon, Cosimo Bevarelli, and Mark Bacchetta will present the key findings of the 3 substantive sections in a moment. Let me first emphasize that as this is the trade dialogue, we would really welcome any questions or comments from you. So please use the Q&A function of the Zoom platform, which is at the bottom of your screen, to raise your questions throughout the presentation. I'll collect the questions and ask our speakers to react to them at the end of the presentation. Now, without further ado, let me give the floor to Marco Buon, who will present the key findings of Section B.
Greetings from Geneva in this afternoon of the 10th of February. I will present Section B of the report, which sets the scene essentially of the report and gives information about government and innovation policies, its background, definition, evolution, and use. Clearly, and that's the starting point of the report, as a matter of fact, there has been a resurgence of industrial policies in the period since the financial crisis. In the decade since the financial crisis, government intervention in the economy has come back into fashion. Over 110 countries have articulated new industrial policies, Industry 4.0, or digital transformation plans by the end of 2019. The overriding scheme of new industrial policies is to encourage technological upgrading, digitalized production, and digital innovation, whether this innovation is new in the world or new in the country. Countries at all levels of development have policies geared to support innovation and the digital transition. The COVID-19 pandemic imposed a massive use of digital solution in a world temporarily characterized by the mobility of person, but the mobility of goods. And COVID policy responses have also been increasing previous trends to accelerate the transition of domestic resources towards digitization of goods and processes, and to focus on innovation solutions to regain domestic capabilities with the aims of reducing dependence on trade for emergency-related goods and services. Now, when I define the new industrial policy wave as being primarily in a forward-looking manner, looking at a technological upgrading, digitalization of production and innovation. It doesn't mean that it is only aiming at this. And as in such any of such government policy phases or new phase of industrial policies, there is always a duality inherent to these phases. On the one hand, the policies aim at addressing the difficulties of modernizing traditional industries. So there is a defensive element to the new industrial policies and supporting the transition to the new economy, which is the objective we're looking more at in the reports, but not only. So we're also looking at the defensive part in some of the subsections of section B of the reports, and I will not present much of these statistical results, but I would like to highlight them. So continuing on the forward-looking and on the transition and to the digital economy, we ask ourselves two questions in this section. One was, what was changing in the economics of the digital economy, and what were the implications of these changes in designing policies or in designing this new wave of policies at the national level. So what's changing with the economics of the digital economy? Well, there are new features in the digital economy that have an implication, of course, for the design of policies. For example, data are key inputs in the digital economy. Some refer to data as a new oil, because like oil, data feeds into pretty much every economic activity. Such a notion is not entirely accurate, however, because unlike oil, data are also non-rival. The fact that I can download a song from the internet does not prevent anyone or affect anyone's other person's ability to download the same song. Because of the non-rival nature, data are ubiquitous, and the amount of data carried by the internet grew exponentially. Secondly, many digital technology are considered to be general purpose technologies. Because they are widely used and they benefit society at large, because they improve in quality while their costs are going down over time, and because it can generate innovation. Just as steam engine, electricity, and computer, which have fueled the first, second, and third industrial revolution, digital technology are believed to bring about the fourth industrial revolution, hence the 4.0 policies. Third, goods and services are increasingly integrated. For many of the manufacturing products, such as a car or a smartphone, most of the value added from the research comes from the research, the design, and the services embedded into such product. I like this example whereby when you use want in a traditional thermic engine car to want to have the sport model, you would order a new engine. Now, with the digital economy, in an electric car, if you want the sports model, you download it. Fourth, many companies in the digital economy can scale up very rapidly. Digital companies no longer rely on heavy physical investment, at least at the onset, but rather on intangible assets. Imagine if you're setting up a new digital company, the initial investment can involve only a little bit of research and development, setting up simple facilities and hiring a few employees, but the cost of producing one additional unit of digital products, particularly internationally, can be almost zero. If you think of, for example, expanding into a new country and creating 1 million new social accounts, social media accounts. This means that a firm can scale up and reach international markets without owning, at least at the beginning, very large foreign assets once its size reaches a critical state. This can lead to winner-take-all dynamics in the digital economy. And finally, all these changes are happening at a breakneck pace, which requires policymakers to stay flexible, develop and adapt policies that are fit for purpose in that digital age. Just let me give two visual representation of what I've just said. Digital technologies spread rapidly in all sectors. Here, the chart shows that the share of IT equipment and software in the net capital stocks of the main sectors in the US. Some sectors adopted IT very rapidly. For example, the share of IT equipment and software in the total capital stock in the information sector reached over 30% of the total in the US, while in professional administration and management services, it is about 20%. In other sectors such as agriculture, IT technologies have been slower to be adapted, but the use of digital technology is nonetheless also increasing over time. And here another chart about the relative price indices of personal computers, computer software, wireless telephone services and internet services relative to the aggregated consumer price index. For example, the price of electricity, which is widely regarded as a general purpose technology of the 20th century, is presented by comparison. And while this price of electricity has remained stable since the 1970s, you can see that the relative price of personal computers has fallen by a factor of 30 since 1997, and the price of computer software has fallen by more than 80% at the same time. The relative price indices of wireless telephone services and internet services fell roughly by 2/3 and by half respectively over the same period. So what are the policy implications of such changes at the national level? Well, take data being the key input. Well, that means what for policy design? It means that first, data availability or policy that drive data availability matter, and they matter very much. Data availability, data localization, data privacy are important variables that the authorities are taking into account. It also means that we are in the presence of a much less capital-intensive model, which means that the governments, compared to previous phases of industrial policymaking, need less upfront capital to build or to help build a new sector. And of course, since it is less of a physical capital-intensive model, we are talking about more knowledge, intellectual property / education-intensive model. Hence, the emphasis put by innovation policies on the development of the technology sector, but the education sector in science as well. How to generate innovation in the digital sector is the whole question, the overall question that governments have to answer when they design the policy, whether you are, as a country that aims to be at the frontier of innovation, which is generating innovation that are new in the world, or whether you are a country that wants to bring the new technology in the country in order to develop from this base a position in the emerging e-supply chain. Now, what does this mean? It means a large focus on research and development. And so that means that the kind of support that is going to be through R&D proposed by the governments is going to be much more horizontal, unless this R&D support is what we call mission-based, that is aimed at creating a particular product or achieving a particular mission. For example, sending a man in the moon in a different period, or trying to expand, a particular artificial intelligence project across country. Most of the R&D supports, which is generally fiscal support, is going to be horizontal, because you do not know in advance what kind of innovation will come out of the support that is provided. Secondly, the use of tech hubs and the attraction of talent matters very much in this framework. Of course, the support to startup and entrepreneurship matters. Thirdly, support to open source technology and in helping develop these open source technology, precisely also with the development of the infrastructure, helps develop an indigenous software industry, and that matters very much in the minds of policymakers. And a lot of countries recognize that they would continue to benefit from importing knowledge, and hence the remaining importance of foreign direct investment, immigration. Some countries accord special visas for, let's say, software developers or specialists in the digital economy, and integrating into the shifting supply chains, not the least to allow for the integration of those new digital processes in manufacturing, even when you're a country that participates in physical supply chains, bringing in the know-how to integrate the digital processes in that area of your specialization matters very much. The digital economy requires at the very onset a very good access to the network. It may not necessarily mean the latest 5G networks, but it means a reliable, equitable, open access to the existing network. And that means that policies are being designed for the relatively cheap and reliable access to the infrastructure goods and to the infrastructure services, that is the internet and the telephony network. It allows, at least once this network is reliable, all countries to potentially develop a local app industry, which we see emerging in a lot of developing countries. Now, of course, there are flip sides to the digitalization of production. There are quick changes, the need to retrain workers. It poses challenges to countries which have a high share of workers in the manufacturing sector, and that is taken into account also in the design of policies. Finally, we talked about winner-takes-all effect, but this is also increasingly integrated into the design of policy, although we will speak about it later in the report. Now, when we do look at statistically how much or what is the intensity of the use of R&D support, of what is the intensity in the use of tariff in the design of policies, and I encourage you to go in the second part of section B of the report, we do find indeed that a lot of countries use R&D to promote specifically innovation, but that tariff liberalization still is used to support digitalization and the ICT, information and communication technology sector expansion, as much as a new policy instrument that you did not find in earlier phases of policy making are there to foster digital innovation, like tech cluster, new data policies, regulatory sandboxes. We provide statistics about this. Investment policy continue to have a central piece of government policy. Just to give you an example, almost 100 countries are providing investment incentive that would apply to this sector as well, and investment facilitation measure. Importing knowledge remains an overriding priority of government. Industrial policies are still widely used also in traditional sectors, and as I said in the beginning of my presentation, we provide statistics about that. Coming back to R&D funding, you would see that the higher the level of income among the different countries, the higher the participation of the private sector to the R&D effort is, the higher is from the private sector, and the government would would provide a lower contribution to it, essentially, as I said, a fiscal contribution, but the lower the level of development, proportionally the higher share of government R&D support in the general effort of that economy to support R&D. We also show this chart, which is the rapid expansion of information technology products. It's been quadrupling in about 25 years. And during the same period, as you know, the World Trade Organization has zeroed in tariff, which allowed for a lot of countries to acquire at a relatively, or at least more affordable rates and prices, the infrastructure to be present in the digital sector. Tech clusters, I've been mentioning this. It's been used as increasingly as an innovation policy, and you have here a measure of it. And what you do see actually in a number of developing countries, I will not mention the well-known digital innovation clusters and areas of agglomeration, as we say as economists. But I think what matters to understand is that increasingly special economic zones that you would see in developing countries that used to produce, let's say, technology products are now turning gradually into tech clusters to integrate the digital aspects and the digital service aspect to the new economy. Finally, data regulation are also widely used, and you see that in line with what I've been saying, that is the development of the new innovation and industrial policies, there has been accompanying expansion of data, of the number of data regulation that we're providing a framework to the expansion of the digital economy. If you're looking at the role of developing countries, well, you would still see least developed countries lagging in terms of access to the digital infrastructure, but at the same time, you would see that in certain niches, you would see a number of the least developed countries having made a dent. For example, mobile banking in sub-Saharan Africa being a leader of it. And I would just like to say one word about developing countries. Developing countries see opportunities in the ongoing digitalization of manufacturing production and into tapping into the new digital services supply chains, like having a place in e-commerce, being able to supply digitized services through the internet and remotely, or developing local app industries, which we do see more and more in every country. The internet offers great opportunities for business in low-income countries to access international market at low costs. There are also challenges relating to the digital divide, as we just showed with this previous chart, both in infrastructure acquisition as in skill levels. With this, this chapter setting the scene, I will let now my colleague Cosimo Beverelli explain the following section, section C.
Thank you, Mark. So section C of the Water Report 2020 deals with the economic rationales and with the impacts of innovation policies. And it addresses several questions. Which market failures justify innovation policy? How do the rationales for innovation policy change in the digital age? The section also looks at which policies promote innovation and through which channels, and how can digital innovation be fostered by policy. We also look at what is the impact of digital innovation on within country inequality. And finally, we also consider the spillover effects of innovation policy on other countries. Looking at both the positive and negative spillover effects and considering how, whether and how they change in the digital age. So the first type of market failure that justifies government intervention in the innovation market is the public good aspect of technology that Mark has already alluded to. So some outcomes of innovation have the characteristics of public goods, being non-excludable and non-rival in consumption. And the public goods, we know, are supplied in inefficiently low quantities by the market because there is a gap between private returns and higher social returns. There are several examples in the digital age. A first example being the imperfect appropriability of the results of digital innovation. And the second example, as discussed already, is the public good nature of non-proprietary data. Second type of market failure is the general purpose technology nature of technology and the economy-wide spillovers that, that this creates. So the introduction and adoption of a general purpose technology, including digital technologies, is subject to a series of market failures, ranging from positive externalities, which lead to their under-provision, to coordination failures across industries that use the technology, to public good aspects of general purpose technologies that are infrastructure in nature. Because of these characteristics, general purpose technology also tends to be undersupplied by the market, justifying government intervention. Third, there are financial frictions. Innovative activity is characterized by asymmetric information between the potential innovator and the potential financer, who knows less about the future prospects of the innovation than the potential innovator. And therefore, R&D investment will be underfunded, creating a rationale for government financing of innovation. Now, the problem might be less relevant in digital innovation than in the traditional economy, because investment in physical assets matters relatively less. A lot of capital in the digital age is intangible, but still the problem of underfinancing of innovation still exists in the digital economy. Fourth, there are coordination failures in the digital age because complex activities like innovation are subject to a lot of coordination among stakeholders, and government action may be justified by the need to coordinate the different parties involved in the innovation process. So just to give an example, to support the economic development of the digital economy, the government may need to coordinate the co-financing of communication infrastructures, as well as the activities of all the stakeholders, such as traditional industry, digital technology or service providers, and research institutions. Finally, as already discussed by Mark, there are winner-take-all effects and dynamic inefficiencies. So how do these winner-take-all effects rise? They rise in the presence of economies of scale, scope, and learning, in the presence of network externalities, that is, situations where the value of a network increases with additional users. This is the case of social media, switching costs, habitual usage, and technology lock-in. All these characteristics of sectors or activities, they give rise to winner-take-all effects, by which a dominant firm comes to dominate the whole market, and dynamic inefficiencies, by which a dominant technology may be locked in, even if it becomes obsolete over time. As I said, the section also considers several impacts of innovation policy, classifying them based on the factors that are targeted by innovation policy. First, there are policies affecting market size. So when the market is large, firms have a greater incentive to innovate because the potential profits are larger. And which policies affect market size? We discussed policies that increase access to foreign markets, government procurement in innovative sectors or activities. These policies enlarge the size of the market and therefore provide additional incentives for firms to invest in R&D and innovate. Second, there are policies that affect directly the incentives of firms to invest in R&D or affect directly the productivity of R&D, such as government tax incentive and R&D grants, the policies that favor the supply of human capital that is then involved in innovative activities, such as STEM graduates, policies that favor knowledge spillovers, such as trade openness and open data policies, and horizontal policies that more generally create an innovation-friendly environment, such as the creation and maintenance of high-speed broadband. Third, governments may positively affect innovation with policies that increase the appropriability of research results. So what is the issue? The extent to which firms can benefit from the reward of the results of their research determines their willingness to invest in R&D. And so this dimension is determined by two aspects. First one is technological, if you want, has to do with the nature of innovation and whether the innovation can be easily imitated or upgraded by competitors or not. Second is the degree of legal protection granted to the innovation through the intellectual property system, which is obviously a policy variable. Fourth, we also look at policies affecting product market structure. So the issue is that the degree of competition in the product market has an impact on the potential benefits of R&D investment because it determines the level of profits and the likelihood of displacing competitors. Trade policy and how it affects foreign firms' access to domestic market is one of the factors that affects the competitive environment. And another factor is obviously the domestic regulation of the competitive environment. Of course, there are links between the rationales for innovation policy and the types of innovation policy. For instance, the public good nature of knowledge, the general purpose technology nature of some technologies, financial frictions, coordinator failures, positive externalities, they all lead in one direction, which is the under-provision of innovation relative to what would be socially optimal. And therefore, the policies that enlarge market size, increase the productivity of R&D, ensure the appropriability of research investments, by reducing the gap between the social and private returns to innovation, they have the potential to increase innovation investment above the inefficiently low market levels, therefore remedying the under-provision of innovation. Another example, in the presence of network externalities, there are incentives for the winners, that is for firms that have managed to capture large shares of the market to engage in anti-competitive behavior and to lock in their technology. In this respect, policies that ensure that markets are contestable and policies that regulate the abuse of dominant position address these issues. We also dedicate some attention to the issue of whether digital innovation affects within country inequality. So as it was discussed already in previous Water reports, digital innovation favors skilled workers and workers performing non-routine tasks. The resulting effects on labor markets, which get progressively more polarized, are of course in itself a source of inequality. Moreover, digital innovation, because it creates winners, big winners, tends to increase top income inequality. However, we also argue that digital innovation does not necessarily increase broad inequality as long as it is related to social mobility. So the impact of digital innovation on within country inequality is not univocal. In the last part of the section, we consider the cross-border spillover effects of innovation policy. And we look at various types of spillover effects. The first one is knowledge spillovers and technology diffusion across borders. These imply that innovation in one country can benefit the innovation activity of all other countries by increasing the global stock of knowledge. So if I can summarize this result in a sentence, global innovation leads to national growth, and national innovation leads to global growth. The second is less benign. In imperfectly competitive markets, different policy tools, while affecting innovation, can also shift trends from a producer in one country to a producer in another, and therefore innovation policy can effectively become strategic trade policy. Third, tax competition that attracts company headquarters or superstar inventors, or that imposes localization requirements on data, is likely to harm other economies by reducing their capacity to invest in R&D. And fourth, there can be supply and demand effects that lead to cross-border spillovers. So I don't want to spend too much time on this slide. It suffices to say that supply and demand effects can both be positive and negative on third countries. Finally, cross-border industry linkages, that is industry linkages within global value chains, can magnify the cross-border effects of innovation policies. For instance, if you have innovation in upstream industries, this can benefit foreign downstream industries or harm them, depending on the effects on prices and availability of inputs. So even in this case, the qualification of spillovers as positive or negative is an empirical question. It's not ex ante determined. Finally, we discuss in this section how cross-border spillovers of innovation policies change in the digital age. And the bottom line is that cross-border externalities are likely to intensify in the digital age for the following reasons. First, knowledge spillovers will increase as economies move towards knowledge-based structures. Second, the winner-takes-all characteristics of many digital industries make these industries prone to applications of strategic trade policy. Third, network externalities, which are inherent in digital industries, the winner-take-all effects, can cause sharp supply and demand effects, and sharper than in traditional economy. And fourth, if the performance of upstream industries like IT or electronic equipment improves due to digital innovation, this can have very wide downstream positive effect on digital enabled industries. And these positive effects can be large enough to overcome the negative supply side effects of such policies, such as overcapacity or price depression. So let me conclude with the main results of the section. We argue that there are several market failures that justify innovation policy, including policy to foster digital innovation. We further argue that there are several types of innovation policies, including digital innovation, that address these market failures. Digital innovation may increase top income inequality, but not necessarily broad inequality within countries. And finally, spillover effects of innovation policy on other countries can be positive or negative. For what is sure is that the relevance is likely to increase in the digital age. This concludes the presentation of section C. I give the floor to Mark, who will present section D.
Thank you, Cosimo, and good afternoon to everyone. So, as we have seen, national innovation policies serve domestic policy objectives And at the same time, through their impact on trade, they generate positive and negative international spillover effects. Building on these findings, Section D focuses on international cooperation and how it can help maximize the positive international spillovers of innovation policies and help minimize their negative effects on trading partners. Section D is in two main parts. The first part of the section discusses the existing framework of international cooperation, while the second part considers whether we need more cooperation on innovation policies in the digital world. I'll just start with a discussion of the existing framework of international cooperation. Our examination of the multilateral trading system suggests that it makes a major contribution to innovation worldwide and to the diffusion of technologies by stimulating competition and trade. As discussed in previous sections of the report, open trade, competition from foreign firms, and linkages with foreign firms through importing, exporting, or supplying multinationals leads firms to innovate. The multilateral trading system provides certainty while also promoting cooperation and enabling flexible responses to new problems. The section distinguishes disciplines in WTO agreements, provisions in RTAs, and the work in other international organizations. Focusing first, more specifically on the WTO, we find that existing disciplines and commitments promote trade and innovation. Multiple rounds of tariff reductions have definitely helped trade, innovation, and the transfer of technology, but so have also disciplines incorporating basic principles such as non-discrimination, transparency, reciprocity, or the prohibition of unnecessary trade restrictive measures, combined with a preservation of policy space for addressing important societal concerns. The WTO agreements ensure certainty and flexibility, which are crucial for deploying innovation-related policies. We also find that WTO disciplines, while predating the emergence of digitalization, continue to promote trade and innovation in the digital world. The report discusses the main relevant WTO agreements. I'll just mention a few. The Information Technology Agreement, by reducing tariffs on imports of IT products, has contributed to make essential technologies, tools and infrastructure equipment, notably internet infrastructures, more affordable. The Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement has contributed to the emergence of global open source standards of digital technologies. The procedural and transparency rules of the Government Procurement Agreement facilitate innovation, procurement, including for digital technologies. And the GATS has allowed WTO members to design and implement innovation policies, and it has stimulated the liberalization of telecommunications and internet-based services, which play a key role in supporting continued innovation in the digital age. The report also examines relevant provisions in regional trade agreements. And our mapping shows that only a limited number of RTAs include provisions explicitly addressing industrial and innovation policy. However, many other provisions in RTAs can both constrain and support industrial and innovation policy in the digital age. While some of the latter provisions replicate or build on existing WTO agreements, many other provisions establish new commitments in areas such as data protection and localization, competition, and IP in the digital era. Finally, the report also discusses the important role of other international organizations in promoting innovation and the transfer of digital technologies. To take just a few examples, UNCTAD, the International Telecommunications Union, UNECE, ISO, and others promote harmonization and mutual recognition of standards and regulatory frameworks. WIPO addresses IP-related issues. OECD and UNCTAD address tax and competition issues. The World Bank and ITU tackle challenges in ICT infrastructure. NITC, UNIDO, and the World Bank, amongst others, support digital inclusion and MSME participation. Turning now to the second part of the report, I'll briefly, not of the report of the section, sorry. I'll briefly discuss our main findings regarding the new needs for international cooperation on innovation policies that may arise in the digital world. We distinguish four main areas. First, the rising importance of data in production and trade may lead to increasing demands for new international rules on data transfer, data localization, and data privacy. And I'll come back to this. I'll come back to all four actually areas in more detail. Second, innovation in digital equipment industries which produce general purpose technologies generates positive network effects for downstream digitally enabled industries across the world, as Cosimo explained. International cooperation can encourage national governments to support innovation in digital equipment industries. Third, the winner-takes-all characteristics of many digital industries could induce governments to use strategic innovation policy. Again, this is something that has been covered by Cosimo. If this is the case, international cooperation can help limit the negative cross-border effects from such policies. Finally, the rapid economic growth of some emerging countries with active innovation policies and increasingly large cross-border spillover effects is raising questions regarding how to accommodate the needs of developing countries. More specifically, the report argues that international cooperation on data governance could be helpful. It could encourage a closer examination of the relationship between data policies and innovation and contribute to a better understanding of the long-term effects of such policies. It could also help to find mechanisms to share the benefits from international flows of data. And it could harmonize standards for data protection across countries or develop mutual recognition criteria to build trust and help prevent the spread of excessively restrictive data policies or a possible race to the bottom in terms of privacy and security standards. With regard to digital trade and investment, international cooperation could help governments to open up and stimulate competition in the digital services sector so as to promote digital innovation. It could help prevent the introduction and possible spread of barriers to cross-border digital trade and make cross-border digital trade an engine of development. And it could help encourage and facilitate investment in broadband infrastructure or the digital industry to promote innovation in the digital world. From this perspective, the Joint Statement Initiative on Investment Facilitation for Development and Aid for Trade definitely have a role to play. With regard to government support, international cooperation could also help. It could help explore ways to expand the flexibility for governments to use R&D subsidies with important positive international spillovers. It could help design mechanisms to share the benefits arising from innovation policies between countries. Because in the absence of such mechanisms, national governments may not provide enough support for innovation, as again discussed previously, if they fear that most of the benefits from the innovation they support will leak abroad. The report also argues that international dialogue and cooperation have a role to play with regard to anti-competitive practices. It could enhance mutual understanding and awareness of policy effects. It could encourage governments to use competition policy to help companies contest global markets and create markets for innovative products, rather than to appropriate monopoly profits in the global market through the support of national champions. Relevant cooperation and experience sharing has taken and is taking place in various fora, such as in certain RTAs and in organizations such as the International Competition Network, UNCTAD, and the OECD. Last but not least, cooperation is needed to ensure that innovation policies are inclusive and promote development. The report reviews a number of findings from the economic literature that may inform the discussions in this area. First, the report concludes that there is no consensus regarding the optimal design of innovation policies. Second, it observes that empirical evidence on the size of spillovers is scarce. Third, it discusses the argument according to which policies to promote technological development are likely to be different for countries close to and far from the technology frontier. It also discusses the argument that market failures are bigger for countries with lower levels of development and thus require more corrective policies, as well as the argument that agglomeration forces are active at the international level, thus potentially leading to economic divergence between the core of the global economy and the periphery. Finally, it discusses the argument that reform lock-in effects of membership of international organizations can be beneficial. This is it. I'll now give back the floor to Ankai, who will handle or sort of organize the questions and answer session.
Thank you so much, Mark Au revoir, Mark Becchetta, and Cosimo. So these has been an excellent presentations. We have heard a wealth of insights and information today. While we wait for more questions from the audience, I would like to summarize a few key takeaways for this presentation. So first, we have heard that government intervention is really back in style. In a decade since the global financial crisis, government intervention in the economy have strengthened, and countries at all levels of development have policies geared towards supporting innovation and the digital transition. And the second, government policy toolkit today reflects the unique characteristics of the digital economy. These policies focus on, first, encouraging innovation and knowledge sharing. Second, developing data policies and regulations. Third, supporting the development of an access to digital infrastructure. Fourth, addressing winner-take-all dynamics and employment concerns arising from a rapid digital transition. And the third takeaway I took from the presentations is that there are opportunities and challenges for developing countries. Developing countries can see opportunities in the ongoing digitization of manufacturing production and in tapping into the new digital services supply chain. There are also challenges relating to the digital divide in both digital infrastructure and the skills upgrading. Now, the fourth takeaway is that open trade can make innovation policies more effective at achieving their stated goals. Open trade is really a multiplier for the contemporary government policies to promote innovation and participation in the digital economy. Foreign competition can push local firms to innovate more, and participating in global value chains can enable quicker access to foreign markets and cutting-edge technology. Now, finally, looking back 25 years ago, even though the WTO was created 25 years ago, the rule book has proved to be forward-looking with regard to the digital economy. Now, looking ahead, one thing is very clear. As governments in economies try to drive technological upgrading and the digital innovation, policies will have cross-border spillover effects. Many of them are positive, and some of them can be negative. International cooperation to foster shared understandings about these policies would lay a firmer foundation for innovation, investment, and cross-border business to flourish. Now I see that there are quite some questions we have received from the audience. I'll read them out, and then whoever among the panelists would like to respond, please just go ahead. The first question comes from Hubert Esquet, one of our former colleagues. He says that very interesting and very timely presentation. The year 2021 is the UN International Year for Creative Economy, and this report contributes to understanding what is the creative and innovation economy in the 21st century, and what are the challenges and opportunities. Now, he said that there are many references to new industrial policies, which are often characterized as the smart industrial policies. So his question is, what are the main differences between today's smart industrial policies and old style industrial policies? I see that Mark would like to respond to this question.
Yeah, this question, short question, is at the heart of section B of the report, and will actually trigger a fairly long answer. But let's say, and what I've been trying to convey in my initial presentation is that the economic characteristics of digital sectors, like the asset-light model, where businesses own relatively fewer capital assets relative to the value of their operations, and the objective of government intervention, for example, building the e-connectivity infrastructure or encouraging local innovation, such as software or application making, knowledge diffusion, data policy, and so on, are all shaping the nature and form of the instruments used in the digital space. For example, large capital infusions, which may previously have been used to build capacity in capital-intensive sectors such as metals, shipbuilding, and other very capital-intensive sectors, may in part be replaced in the subsidy field, if you want, by more limited grants and tax incentives for R&D in that digital space, which is less intensive in terms of physical capital. But that's only one example. And it doesn't mean that the overall amount of support used internationally may be less necessarily in a new sector than it has been in the old sector. So the question arises at what is really new and what is a simple adaptation of policy instruments already used in those traditional sectors. And here I would like to direct my former colleague to table B3 of the report that tries to establish a taxonomy of the innovation and industrial policy tools used at different periods in the old days, let's put it that way, and with examples in the digital age. And here we do it by categories. We have a fairly long taxonomy. We're looking at border measures, support measures, local content requirements, government procurement, agglomeration, regulatory measures and standards, investment measures, skills and learning, intellectual property, data policies. So let me just take up a few from this table. Clearly, certain policy tools and instruments are integral to the digital economy. That's data policies, for example. R&D support measures such as tax breaks to support specific digital innovation and skills and knowledge creation and diffusion can be considered as pretty much attached to the digital sectors. Now, of course, certain instruments, when applied to the digital sector, look more familiar, such as incentive for investment and the promotion of intellectual property. That's not new to the digital sector itself. Perhaps the novelty here is in the requirement for a better articulation of policies supporting the establishment of the new digital supply chain, which includes telecom and internet infrastructure and connectivity, and the networks necessary to undertake electronic commerce and other digital services, as well as the skills necessary to participate in the digital economy as a producer of local application. Several innovation-based policies are not new, but are now applied to spur innovation in the digital economy. Let me take that again, that innovation, that example of the greater emphasis on tax incentive and tax breaks in the digital field. Tax reduction are available horizontally across several policy fields. For example, upon investment, to foster patent and other intellectual property creation, so as to facilitate the adoption of digital processes in traditional industrial sector, to create new software services and to boost R&D. That's fairly developed across the different countries. A variety of grants exists. For example, when governments offer to match paid-up capital for SMEs, or to provide funding to universities and national scientific institutes for research on advanced software and digital technologies. Now, there are areas which may mobilize larger direct funding from governments, such as what I called mission-oriented grants for the development of cutting-edge, let's say, quantum computing, which is one area that can be identified pretty much in the same style as a supercomputer project of the 1980s, and that obviously is not new. But government funding can also be made available to upgrade enabling telecom and internet infrastructures, which requires significant and multi-annual public and private sector investment. Now, let's discuss about technology and science parks. They have existed for decades too, but digital technical hubs and other similar agglomerative formulae aim at maximizing knowledge spillovers by bringing together universities, startups, and occasionally government research institutes under individual or group projects. And that's fairly new. The agglomeration of talents and skills is a key component of this digital economy, and it's been fairly popularized. And the benefits in some countries from support of specific immigration policies aim at attracting the highly skilled human resources that goes with such agglomeration. An important category of policy is innovation-based government procurement. Such policies can take various forms, which are described in the taxonomy that I've been mentioning. Via government procurement, R&D contracts can be allocated to innovating firms and groups of firms. Incentives can be provided for local firms to supply locally developed goods and services, such as software and digital applications. That's fairly common too. And for markets that can be created to develop local technology. But one area that I remain very specific to the digital economy is national data policies, and they are really at the heart of the policy toolkit. They generally aim at increasing the accessibility and to ease data sharing among users, but also to regulate data availability for various purposes, including societal, scientific, and economic purposes. Policies may provide guidance on charges for information, on open data provision, on the collection and the exchange and disclosure and the licensing and the privacy protection aspect of data use. So this is one area that I would consider to be really specific. Now, as you heard from my responses, there are sort of revamped policy that existed before, but that are now adapted to the innovation, spurring innovation in the digital field. And they are more familiar instruments, but that are there associated with the other policy to spur innovation in the digital field, like, for example, trying to encourage the transfer of intellectual property into the countries. So that's pretty much my responses. There are specific areas, data, there are adapted areas and instruments, and there are those which are accompanying, like IP or investment policy that we use to have in, let's say, electronics manufacturing, but that continue to be there for the digital economy. Thank you.
Excellent, a very comprehensive response to an excellent question. Another question we have received is from Professor Nordas from Sweden, and her question is, a number of studies and surveys show that the uptake of technology is slow. For instance, surveys show that less than 10% of firms in major countries use available AI-based technology. So how do you envisage that trade policy could help stimulate not only technology spillovers for innovation, but also for the uptake of technology? So
we do not in the report look at the literature on technology adoption. which is a very interesting stream of literature, but is pretty far away from the trade literature. But we considered several strands of the international trade literature that show that technological upgrading occurs in the wake of trade liberalization. There is, for instance, similar evidence for Argentina. We also mention a lot of research, both using firm-level data and sector-level data, which shows productivity increases due to liberalization on the input market. So higher quality imported inputs lead to increases in innovation and productivity by firms that uses this input for downstream production. And third, we also mention and discuss the literature that shows that joining global value chains increases productivity, both because of knowledge spillovers within global value chains, but also because of intentional knowledge transfer between the firms that are linked in value chains. So short answer, trade does not only lead to technology spillovers, but trade policy can actively induce more innovation and productivity increases.
Great, thank you very much. We have another question from Mr. Mark Lobat. The question is in French, but I will just summarize it in English. His question is, what could be the effects of innovation policy on developing countries and least developed countries, especially since these countries have little financial means to support the digital economy? And maybe related with that, if I can ask further, that we know there's winner-take-all dynamics in the digital economy, and we see a lot of the key players in the digital economy are concentrated in a handful of high-income countries. So what can be the gains for many developing countries in the transformation to the digital economy, and especially what policies could be put in place for small enterprises in developing countries to participate in the global digital value chains? So I see Mark has raised his hand.
Well, it could be also another long answer. There are obviously gains and challenges related to developing countries' integration into the international digital economy. Let's not forget first that digitization means integrating digital technologies in the traditional production process. So let's take manufacturing. Digital technology allow new and better prints for garments, for example. Machines are digitally connected, provide for new functionality, and that's a lot what the digital economy does. It changes the functionality of a particular manufacturing process or the functionality of a particular product or a particular machine. Then, thus allowing Bangladesh or other countries to move up the value chain in that particular sector. Now, for the better, but also there are employment challenges related to that. Of course, it has to do with the modernization of mechanization and hence the new functionalities of machinery that will change the lives and the skills of the workers that work with it. Now, sometimes the change does not come necessarily only internationally. I have an example of a particular southeastern Asian country, which is also a garment producer that has about 700,000 young people, mostly working in the garment production sector, but that has in parallel a software and app sector of about 40,000 young people. And of course, the change that come from one sector may filter into the other sector, which is largely labor intensive. And so there are opportunities and there are threats. Now, with respect to the digitized services, which is something also I mean, slightly different. Opportunities are endless and already a reality for many developing countries. Some developing countries are working hard to develop an offer to make themselves attractive for services. So that's what I call making your own slot into the development of the supply chain, allowing, for example, local or international corporation to do their own accounting or to provide marketing services online, or for hospitals and doctors of certain developing countries to provide diagnosis services online. And so digital means providing opportunities for this service sector to develop, but also for a local app industry to support those new services. New softwares. I mean, there is this view that softwares are developed internationally by international firms. This is not always true. I have in mind the example of a landlocked country in Central Asia that is using, because of its geography, where users are using a lot mobile banking, because banks are just not available in the remote areas of the city, so of the country. So people are using a lot mobile banking. You would be surprised that the software developed for the use of those mobile banking is supplied by other developers in neighboring developing countries as a part of supply chain, by the way. That country is also supplying developer to the hub that developed the software for the use of mobile banking apps locally. So I think that one thing that come up with the digital economy is the sense that these digital sectors are allowing for traditional network-based services, let's say banking, which cannot be expanded at good cost, or travel, which used to be supplied by a network of travel agencies, for these services to be rendered and provided much more cheaply and locally. Hence the mobile banking apps in Africa. So by saving on the fixed cost of development of these network based services, local digital services are actually a cost saver and a provider of cheaper services to users of the local economy. And hence there is a lot to gain for the developing countries to be parts of the digital economy. So it's not necessarily a sort of an international service that could be provided. It's a local service that will improve the efficiency of the local economy. Now, one could tell me that, of course, the developers, the number of developers in these developed countries or in middle-income economy is not endless and may be attracted by the hubs I am mentioning. But what we also observe is that those who are investing in the local app industries are often former developers of hubs, which nationality is coming from of a least developed country, and they decide at the end of their careers to come and invest into the digital economy of their home country because there are opportunities. So again, I think there is space for everyone for actually being part of the new digital economy. And actually, I was surprised when I looked at LDC at the number of LDCs which in their balance of payment had a net positive balance on software exports minus imports.
Great, thank you very much, Mark. We have another question from Sergio Martinez. He's asked that how could governments develop a policy mix that complements the role of innovation policy in addressing market failures and negative externalities of digital goods and services? For example, which additional policies could be needed to increase market size, allow more competition, and skills upgrading for workers as a result of Industry 4.0? Does anyone want to respond to that? Cosimo, please.
I can partly address this question by referring, Sergio, to the box, the opinion piece on page 111 of the report. So we do not in the report discuss in the education policy. But of course, education policy, together with health policy, by the way, is a horizontal type of policy that can have impact on the structure of the economy, and so can be thought of as industrial policy for the digital age. So in this opinion piece by Emily Blanchard of Dartmouth College, it is argued that education and health are at the same time preconditions for economic success and critical drivers of growth in high value added, high innovation sectors of the economy. So this would be my part of the answer to this question.
Thank you, Cosimo. We have another question from Dr. Gabriel Gary, who's from Queen's Mary University of London. He asks that this report finds the need for international cooperation on data and suggests harmonized standards for data protection across countries of development or development of mutual recognition criteria can contribute to this effect. How much of this could be achieved at the multilateral level, given the considerable differences on this matter across WTO members? It's a tricky question. Let's see if anyone, Mark, please.
It's a good question, and it's a difficult question, and the answer is I don't know. What we can see is how the discussion is evolving, and indeed most of the discussion is so far has been at the regional level, and there seems to be a possibility to find an agreement at the regional level, sort of consolidating the approach at the multilateral level may turn out to be indeed very difficult. So we've been exploring this question in a number of webinars all over the year, but I'm not sure that any sort of clear answer to this question has emerged so far. So I think it will be up to members to actually take to discuss this question and at the multilateral level, and to see if there's a way to sort of how should I say, address those differences and find a common ground. But yeah, that's all I can say at this stage, unfortunately.
Thank you so much for your response. So I see we have a lot of questions, but in the interest of time, I think we cannot take more questions unless there's anything that the panelists would like to add. So I think if you have questions that we have not yet responded, we'll hopefully follow up in writing or through other means. And thank you very much for participating in this webinar. It's been a great pleasure for us to have a dialogue with you, including members and members of the academic community. So hopefully this dialogue will continue. Thank you very much.